You're in the hands of an adolescent.
It's mystery. I don't like mysteries. Your bellyache. I gotta kill you right now.
Aye, sir.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to the Warp Core Podcast. I am UrzaMaster. Joining me as always, Lord Uther and Fert Derby. Welcome, 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 gentlemen. We continue our mission into strange new worlds, new civilizations, and boldly and baldly go where few, actually many, have gone before. That is in the Star Trek universe. We are exploring the original series, Star Trek. We have crested into Season 2 here, getting into a pretty good chunk. And we come this week to the episode I think we're probably all ready to talk about after last week's episode. And that, of course, is The Deadly Years. Another interesting off-ship start of an episode, followed up by on-ship hijinks, as we see one of those tropes coming back to haunt us, but not the only trope that makes this episode happen. So without further ado, I'm going to give it over to Fert Derby for some background on The Deadly Years.
Thank you, UrzaMaster. Thank you, Lord Uther. And thanks to all of you pending rebrands who have been with us through 50 plus episodes. We are just one episode away from an entire year's worth of weekly Warp Core content. And how would you want to spend a year any better than subscribing, checking in, clicking on, and dining out on such delicious content that we provide here for you at Pending Rebrand, whether we're in galaxies far, far away or out on strange new worlds, tackling gridiron, or giving you helpful lifestyle tips that can better you and society. So we've got it all. We've got blogs, we've got shorts, we've got longs, we've got cute dogs, we've got even cuter children. We've got it. Cinebits, it's like film school in 40 seconds. Next time you want to impress somebody in a cocktail party, just start citing those Cinebits and you'll have the whole crowd gathered around you, hanging on your every word. Much like we will be hanging for a few moments here on The Deadly Years, which aired on December 8th, 1967. Another Christmas holiday, not themed episode, but dropping during the busy shopping season. Once again, returning champion Joseph Pevney is behind the director's chair. And we have a new writer, and his name was David Harmon. And I have to admit, when I was researching Mr. Harmon, my heart initially fell. And I'm happy to say that my first impressions of what this episode was going to turn out to be were delightfully wrong. Mr. Harmon, he cut his teeth on a variety of television shows, but he's most primarily known for writing not one, not two, but 34 episodes of Gilligan's Island. 34. And if you have ever seen the classic Gilligan's Island sitcom, you'll know that it's basically the same episode for however many seasons that they chose to run it. So to write 34 of those, to come into the office with your Corona typewriter and bang out 34 variations on a single theme as Gilligan's Island, that's got to be a new hazard pay for a writer. But he didn't just stop with the sitcom. He then went on to do two Gilligan's Island made-for-TV movies, 1978's Rescue from Gilligan's Island, and 1981, The Harlem Globetrotters on Gilligan's Island. So this man was committed to the skipper, the movie star, and the rich Thurston Howell and Little Buddy. Like, he knew that franchise inside and out, and it's a shame that we never got a big screen Gilligan's Island, because David Harmon would have been my first call. if they were going to try to make that adaptation. But in any event, despite however you feel about Gilligan's Island, you probably say to yourself, well, this one's going to be a goofy episode of Star Trek. And maybe on its surface, the idea that the crew is stricken with a disease that ages you, to the ghastly ages of between 60 and 72. No, the horror. It actually comes across, I will say from this viewer's perspective, I enjoyed this episode far more than I suppose my going into expectations were. I did not feel that anything was running counter prevalent to what the themes were. I didn't feel that was being undercut, with one exception. There was some very melodramatic music. Once again, we ran into that with Star Trek for the scoring. They kind of oversold some of the horror elements and so forth, and it did become a little bit distracting. Not as distracting as the forced mirth and hilarity that we've commented on this show, which again you'll find when you subscribe to Pending Rebrand and the Warp Core. But that would probably be one of the only things, even the old age makeup, seeing a frosted Scotty and seeing poor Jim Kirk having to kind of go where he goes from a touch of gray to a silver fox. In fact, the makeup on this episode, Leonard McCoy, DeForest Kelley, was famously quoted in a fan magazine or interview in which he said this episode stands out for him because he spent, close to 6 to 7 hours in the makeup chair. And he said they would, go to work at 6 a.m. and they'd apply all of this layering and latex and so forth to him. They'd break, he'd go get a sandwich, then he'd come back and sit in the chair, and they'd have to do another 2 to 3 hours and so forth, in addition to any touch-ups or anything they had to do in between takes when they were on set. And I think someone will bring up shortly that this makeup had a certain deja vu quality for them, but I'll let them share that with us in just a little bit. But overall, this idea that the crew is aging and so forth, and they can't seem to figure out how to stop from becoming mental vegetables. You have Kirk with another old flame. This time the doctor. We have Chapel. She comes back. It's always nice to see Christine. So forth. We have a shirtless captain. I know that Lord Uther is fond of anytime Shatner gets to show off that smooth Canadian chest. But when was the last time we had a show that dealt with advanced arthritis and things like that? And I know that there's more to growing old than just turning into withered crones and crying in the sick bay and so forth. We here have certainly put some age and wisdom on our bones. So it's just sort of an interesting sort of dichotomy to see how, oh man, in an era of the late 60s where it was, the youth were taking over and leading, revolutions and civil rights and sexual freedom and protesting the Vietnam War. It was all about the kids, man. The kids are all right. And all you old fogies are what got us into these foreign wars and economic calamities and so forth. So it is interesting to kind of view it from that lens, that like old is bad. But at the same time, it works. It works dramatically. And it works. I mean, I think the biggest thing I'm interested in my fellow crew members talking about is the stubbornness of Kirk as he sort of, and the sort of setup between him and Spock in terms of finding themselves on opposite sides of the line, even though ostensibly they're both suffering from this condition. Leonard Nimoy, being a Vulcan, he ages differently than, of course, humans, so we had to take his word for it that he was undergoing similar symptoms as his more made-up co-stars there. But this was, and then we had Romulans. we even have a good shout out to the Corbomite. That was a very nice little Easter egg there for season 1 fans and so forth. It worked again. It doesn't matter. The old Corbomite maneuver, definitely, it's right there with the Kobayashi Maru. It's in Kirk's toolbox, and he is not afraid to use it. But even when he would issue orders and then issue them again, and the crew all, did he just say that again? And Captain, you know that the Romulans have cracked that code. I know exactly what I said, Lieutenant. Now take this dictation. Like I said, this episode could have really, hit a bad patch of warp speed like they did in the Star Trek motion picture, with a giant asteroid, being pulled in right in front of them, and they're going to go splat. But I appreciated it. I thought it was fun. I think this is one of the better, again, probably not the highest peak of season 2 as we know it, but this definitely belongs in the conversation with some of the more entertaining episodes for this season. So, gentlemen, how do you feel about getting old?
What a great premise for an episode. An away mission gone awry again. That old trope. Chekhov being scared as a mouse, walking in on a dead body, and definitely this episode could have gotten off on a terrible foot. But finding out that it's like, oh, you're 29 and you look like you're falling off from your skeleton, like another, infected crew comes back to the ship. This time it doesn't spread to the rest of the ship. We find out it's radiation poisoning from a comet tail, which is interesting. I mean, there's some science there, so it's definitely feeling more Trekky, more rooted in science. So the science fiction part's coming through real strong in this episode. And on top of that, you get kind of reasonable explanations when it comes to treating this radiation poisoning and using adrenaline, and that's like, okay, I get it. And you also get this odd interplay of something we literally got to see play out in the Star Trek movies, is the aging cast and crew and how they deal with it. And quite frankly, it was really well done. I think, to have them age so rapidly that they lose their mental faculties, first. And that, to me, was kind of the compelling part of this episode, was that you got to see a flawed Kirk. You got to see a flawed Scotty, a flawed Bones McCoy. What struck me as a little unusual is that of those characters, the most flawed was Kirk.
Right.
And that just highlights the need for a capable commanding officer. But then you also see a completely inept, Commodore who steps in and tries to take over and flies him across a neutral zone and doesn't know how to interact with the Romulans. I guess we'll just give up. And they're like, we can't give up. They don't, those people over there, they don't take prisoners. Oh, you could have had Jimmy Stewart on this episode, and it would have really failed. But luckily, Leonard Nimoy saves this episode.
Yes.
Contrast this with the previous episode, Friday's Child, where Leonard Nimoy seemed bored. You get a very engaged Spock in this episode.
Yeah.
Very, aware of himself, very logical, very probing. You get a courtroom scene, yet another great trope they bring back. You get the Kirk love interest, where she's kind of a, I don't even know how you would put it, an old man chaser, I guess. Married a man 26 years her senior, which, age is just a number, but that is an awful large gap. And then Kirk being like, well, is this just charity? And it's like, even of the era, that feels a little odd. But it was really interesting because, what I'd like to point out is that we're getting close to halfway through season 2, and I think to date I really haven't seen the like stereotypical Kirk we think of, where it's like he's getting with every single, you know, species and alien woman that comes across. It's actually more to the contrary. It's just like, yeah, he's had a lot of old girlfriends, but he's not really like, he doesn't seem to be like that anymore, if you know what I mean. Like, that seemed like those were my wild younger years. And in this case, like, literally speaking, those were his wild younger years. I loved the makeup effects. It until they got really old, it didn't seem over the top or overly cheesy. Like they were able to gray out the hair, give them the wrinkles and the bags under their eyes without, you know, I always think of this fantastic cult classic, The Miami Connection, where they couldn't just hire an old man and they just painted some dude's hair silver to make him like somebody's father. And it's horribly done. And you get some of the silver paint in this episode, but it actually is like feathered in nicely to where it does look fairly legitimate until they're so old that it's like, okay, they just smeared silver paint in their hair. But I would point out, as Fert alluded to in the beginning here, Bones McCoy at his peak of age in this episode almost looks exactly like he does in the first episode of Star Trek The Next Generation. Despite actually being old at the time, they've prematurely aged him in this episode in nearly the same manner. It's very similar to what you'll see. So when we get to Next Generation, I can't wait to kind of compare the two. And he even acts the same way, which I think is really a great testament to his character and the writing, especially on Next Gen. But the other side of this is the way that the aging minds that are supposedly incapable of running the ship come together to solve their own problem. You know, and are able to kind of act, react, and then save the ship, despite the fact that they have, you know, been to this place where they were so fragile of constitution, which does sort of, it has a bit of a progressive tone to it in that, you know, age is not necessarily a determinant factor on whether one can be capable. Although I think it does certainly call that into question in very strong terms. But it's an interesting look at, you know, how humanity adapts in the future, so to speak, you know, to the idea of age and capability and, you know, how to react in a crisis. I still think that in this episode, Kirk getting to the bridge, even in his aged condition, would have stood toe-to-toe with the Romulans no problem. It felt very believable. It also had a bit of that, okay, Grandpa, let's get you to bed kind of feel as well. So the meme of the older woman and her walker should be replaced with Kirk being restrained lightly by compatriots in sickbay. But I'll turn it over to Lord Uther. I'm sure he has a lot to say as well.
I do. Did you know that the older you get, the more your southern drawl starts to kick in and you talk a little slower and you point with a whole hand and your Kirk was doing this whole, Scotty, like his jaw was jutting forward and he's pointing with an entire hand. That's what happens when you hit 50. It's been happening to me, and it's obviously happens here, 51 now. But anyway, so I thought that was pretty funny. Is there a Commodore in Starfleet that doesn't screw up? Because we need to replace all these guys. And like I said, once again, we justify the statue of Kirk outside of Starfleet Academy. The statue probably should be larger than Starfleet headquarters itself, because he just, if it wasn't for him, there'd probably be no Starfleet. I'm pretty convinced of that, because all these Commodores just don't know what they're doing. You think they would know about the enemies and have some intel and know what a ship can do? Only Kirk. He's the only guy. And so I'm trying to figure that out.
No field experience, of course.
Yeah.
But where do you come off?
Yes, go ahead.
Where do you come off on the courtroom stuff when, again, a reluctant Spock is basically putting him on trial, and then we have that Judas yeoman who stabs him right there in the back? But I mean, do you see him as impaired? Do you trust him that he says, "I know what I'm doing"? Like, how does that work for you as the character? I mean, in that dilemma, that to me is some of the strongest, gravel in this episode is.
Well, the crew wants to trust him, right? Because he's Kirk. So, and you kind of see some of that even by the way they like kindly question him when he gives that order, and even Spock is very reluctant to override him at different points. So I think that is a compelling piece when it comes to that. Again, I just can't believe that Commodores get into their positions and can't Commodore themselves. Oh, how great would it have been, instead of having Carol Marcus in Wrath of Khan, we would have had Janet Wallace in Wrath of Khan. That maybe that should have been, if it's this old love interest, maybe she should, because I don't even know where Carol Marcus, I don't think we ever see her in the original series, do we? I don't think so.
We don't know, yeah.
We're seeing her, we're hearing about it now in Strange New Worlds.
Right.
We heard her name, but we haven't seen, I don't think in TOS we ever saw Carol Marcus. So I would have liked to have been and we've talked about this a lot, trying to connect these things to the movies. So I wouldn't mind have seen that. And let me tell you something. I think Quentin Tarantino was a huge TOS fan, because all you need is an adrenaline shot. Give it a shot, right? Just an adrenaline shot and you're healed and everything's fine. Maybe that's where he got the idea for Travolta to use the adrenaline shot in Pulp Fiction. Who knows?
Great observation. And they didn't have to stab Kirk 3 times either.
Yes. So those are some of my thoughts. I think it was... oh, wait a minute. I had one more. I guess I didn't. I thought it was a great episode. It is just some classic Trek where, like you were saying there, UrzaMaster, you're getting all those little pieces, right? You're getting the courtroom. You're getting a little bit of conflict amongst the three of them, questioning their abilities. You get a little bit of Starship stuff. So I feel like it just had that really nice matter antimatter mixture that doesn't throw you into a wormhole like in the motion picture. That's enough tropes for me today.
Absolutely. Well, and I think one thing to point out about this particular episode and where it fits with Star Trek canon is, I don't know that this is one that folks talk about as much. We get a lot of talk of several of the original series episodes, but the Deadly Years, I mean, I've been on the side watching some Next Generation. This has informed a bunch of later episodes of Star Trek. I mean, you get the exact opposite effect in Next Gen season 1, which we'll talk about when we get there. But the same idea of an aged crew member, except doing something in reverse to de-age rather than age up, and several other similar things come up from this episode. I mean, no doubt this is a foundational episode of Star Trek in that regard, which is odd to say, because certainly when I hear Season 2 Star Trek, the original series, my mind does not go to the Deadly Years. I mean, we're still not even to the episode that I think everybody will reference for all of time, for Season 2 in particular. And to be honest, that's an episode that really, other than I think an episode or two of Deep Space Nine, really doesn't come up much. Or actually, one episode of Deep Space Nine and one episode of Picard. And that's interesting. It makes you wonder if the later writers or the later iterations of Star Trek simply looked for these nuggets of gold amongst the rocks. If they were panning for anything, it should be these deeper cuts. And I think that's just where Star Trek does very well. The science fiction is always the deepest cut. And with that, shall we slice through the hull, through the decks, through the lower decks, all the way down to the warp core, where we give this episode, The Deadly Years, its warp core ratings. And this week, I want to kick it off with Fert Derby, because last week's episode was a little bit of a controversy here on the show. Fert, what did you think of the Deadly Years?
I I think this is an easy 6. I found very little. I don't think it quite sticks the landing of a 7. I like it at a 6, and the part that's going to stay with me 6 months from now or 6 years from now is that I saw Kirk. I saw the stubbornness. I saw I root for this character. I know that he's what he's about, but I saw him a little bit exposed on the stand, and that sort of pettiness with Spock. You just waited until the right moment to stab me in the back. I don't think it lessens the character. I don't think it cheapens the character any. It does give him a more human, response, as if you're, I can do my job. Why are you guys trying to, boot me into early retirement here? So it gave me a new way to look at Kirk, and I think there's another episode coming up in the not too distant future where also we'll explore some of the more shades of gray in his characterization. Whenever you can take a character on the side of the angels, Special Agent Dale Cooper, Luke Skywalker, James Tiberius Kirk, and you can introduce a quality. I mean, we hold them up as paragons of virtue, integrity, honesty, bravery, and you can just slightly maybe scrape off one layer of the onion and maybe show something slightly different. That to me it's not only good character work, but it allows the performer to give us a different frequency than we're otherwise used to hearing. I mean, it would be somewhat dull if Kirk was always on the right side of the issues, was always coming out on top. And I don't mean just being captured randomly by some alien species, but I mean the human adventure that he has to undergo through. So I thought that this courtroom sequence in particular really stood out for me in that I'm on Kirk's side. I want him to be in control of the ship, but if I were Spock, and again, Leonard Nimoy, to his credit, bounces back from the sort of disinterest of Friday's Child and really sells it here. Really does a great job. I kind of find myself rooting for Spock in a couple of moments, like duty bound, and a man who goes by the book. So yes, let's go with 6. 5 + 1.
I will go. I'm going to go 6.5. And I take a half point off because I want my physicals to be as easy as laying on my back and just pushing a couple of cardboard boxes into a wall with my feet, which I believe we've seen that before with Kirk. And for a James T. Kirk, he's always in shape. He shouldn't be having physicals. But to see Chekhov doing that, I'm just kidding. I give it a 6.5. It's not, I think those 7s now I'm reserving for probably a future episode, actually. Again, great episode. It's one that I would show to people that maybe want to get on board with Star Trek. The one thing I meant to bring up as well is I really liked a little bit of the banter between Chekhov and Sulu. Like, you're kind of starting to see that form a little bit. And I loved Chekhov's line of just like all the blood that's been taken out of him. Chekhov this, Chekhov. I'm not going to have any blood left by the time we're done. So I thought that was kind of cool as well.
Yep.
But I do like the banter that is building between, or that bond that's building between Chekhov and Sulu as well. So yeah, I'm going to go 6.5 warp cores. Very close to perfect.
Yeah, I think it would be remiss without mentioning Chekhov and his sort of comedic, frustrations that he's venting to Sulu on the bridge. This Chekhov, we need tissue sample. Chekhov, we need blood sample. Chekhov, we need stool sample. Chekhov, hold your breath and bend over. It's really funny. Like, I'm surprised Family Guy has not done some sort of a parody of that moment. Or honestly, I'm a little sad they didn't do it more often on the show. I don't know if it was budget constraints. They couldn't have all the big names in the picture at once, but beautifully done. Well acted by Walter Koenig. Like, this whole episode, I'm going to give it a 6.5 out of 7 as well, because I think you get some of the finest performances out of each of the character actors on the show. Even the yeoman, the
Judas.
little blondie, that they just dumped into the episode because, obviously Grace Lee Whitney wasn't there, did a great job. Like, I really enjoyed her character for a bit part. It was one of those that, like, you were not a throwaway character. You had an economy of words in this episode and you got lines. She did a good job. She really delivered, like, that sort of skittish, probably cadet level yeoman. I'm just trying to help my captain and do my job and go home at the end of the day. Like, if an episode makes you think about a character so minor as that in a good light, this is an episode, yes, absolutely, I would show somebody who wants to get into Star Trek for the first time. And again, surprisingly foundational. Would not have connected those dots immediately were I not also rewatching Star Trek Next Generation right now. So beautiful, beautiful episode here for our 51st Warp Core podcast. Again, we thank you all for coming with us on this journey. We look forward to many more episodes with you all here at Pending Rebrand. If you have not yet subscribed, highly recommend you hit that subscribe button. Hit that notification button to stay up to date with all Pending Rebrand content, particularly our Warp Core podcast, but certainly everything we have is fantastic. And if you have friends who are into Star Trek, Star Wars, or anything else that Pending Rebrand offers, highly recommend sharing this out. Blast it out on Facebook, TikTok, Instagram. You can follow us on TikTok. You can follow us on Facebook. You can follow us on Instagram. And until we see you again, live long and prosper.